Hello and welcome to Lesson 23, Lecture 1, Julius Caesar, Alive. In this lesson, we are going to talk about a number of things, including biography as a genre. We are going to read together Suetonius' Life of Caesar. And finally, we are going to talk about how Julius Caesar actually ended up winning the Civil War. So we are kind of continuing with the theme of Julius Caesar, but we are going to approach it from a new perspective. So the person who is the writer of the biography that we are going to read is called Suetonius, and the genre is biography. Now, of course, today you can just go to a Barnes and Noble, and there's a whole section on biographies. So we kind of take that genre for granted. But in fact, in ancient Rome, this was not a sort of obvious or automatic genre. In fact, the origins of biographies in the ancient world belong to Alexandria, which you recall is in northern Egypt, which was very famous as an educational center in the Hellenistic period in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. And partially, Alexandria, of course, was also named after Alexander the Great. And it is these great historical figures who led to sort of the development of this genre and its prominence in this period. So there are two writers about whom you might hear when you talk ancient biography. The first of those is this guy, Plutarch, who is a Greek writer. And I think it's really educational and helpful to compare him to Suetonius, because the two of them are both writing biographies in the ancient world. They both also, lived around the same time in the 1st century, 2nd century CE, right? A good 100 years after Caesar at least. But their goals and organization and orientation towards writing a biography was quite different. Plutarch, a Greek writer, constructed his lives chronologically, right? So what would that mean? Julius Caesar first was born, then he gets educated, then he starts to do the various offices, and eventually he will be dead. And the emphasis was a very direct evaluation of the character, and the goal was to educate the next generation of leaders. This is how you become a good leader. This is why biography should be read in the first place. And this was very open, like this is what you should learn from this or that guy. This is how you become Alexander the Great. Oh, maybe not all of us can become Alexander the Great. Suetonius, the Latin writer, whose text we are going to read in English today, is a little bit different. So he is obviously writing in Latin. He is someone who is equestrian background, sort of a little bit closer to power. Plutarch is not completely powerless in the Roman Empire as a person, but definitely Suetonius is closer to powerful people, which also gave him access to some documents. And we will see that's going to be very interesting to see sometimes the kind of evidence he's able to incorporate in his lives. One other thing that's super interesting about Suetonius is that he doesn't always directly tell you what he thinks. So, for example, I could say to you, Julius Caesar was a good man, or I could say Julius Caesar was a bad man, or some kind of mix of those two things. Suetonius is very cautious. He is not going to come down one side or another, but rather he will place significant facts in strategic places without additional commentary. Right? So it does matter how you narrate a story. For example, somebody robbed the bank. Okay. And then the police captured them and they were found guilty. They went to jail. That's one way to narrate the story. Another way to narrate this whole story, but in their defense, at some point, let's add in the fact that this person desperately needed that money for some incredibly important key cause. Their child had cancer. And it could really change sort of how we incorporate things and where we mention that, right? Your perspective shifted in the case of our imaginary bank robber. At any rate, the historical agenda that Suetonius has in mind is a little bit different because he is so close to imperial power. He understands something about how the Roman Empire will come to work. And simply put, and this is why I put this on the slide, the interpretation of the empire is now really dependent on the person of the emperor. And I think that this is a really sort of interesting moment for us, sort of in history. And you could pose the same question, sort of asking like, is it important who the leader is, the person of the leader, to tell the world about who we are as a whole group? So who the president is, say, for Americans. And this perspective actually can be sort of very well understood if we think about the perspective of quite a few historians. So for example, on this slide, you see James Parton, who very famously said, if Jefferson was wrong, America is wrong. If Jefferson is right, America is right. So this same idea comes in with this perspective. The last bit I wanted to mention is that the structure of Suetonius's biography is also a little bit different for that reason. So while we saw Plutarch is sort of just going to go from, birth to death, Suetonius follows that structure, but at a certain point he kind of stops and moves into a thematic discussion, like how was the economic policy of that emperor, or how were his games and benefactions, were they nice to soldiers, to the plebs? So it's just a different concept. It almost creates little categories, in which we evaluate each emperor. Now, the way this is again going to look is that there will be two parts in most biographies of Suetonius, and we are going to read a bunch of these, so we might as well sort of start to notice this. And the idea is there's a part one, which goes from origin, childhood, education, political debut, death, burial. When I say origin, by the way, what I mean by that is sort of family descent, which is incredibly important for Romans. And then part two will be this sort of more categorical understanding of personal characteristics, private life, civil, military, political matters. So these are the categories. And I think that in Suetonius sometimes it nevertheless feels that it's not just direct utility, in terms of like, this is how you become a good person, but sometimes there's also an entertainment quality to this. So little anecdotes about the emperors. It's almost like, we love knowing little details about famous people, and he's going to try to offer us those details. So in the case of Suetonius's Life of Caesar, which I actually asked you to read before you look at this lecture, or at least follow along, we can actually go look at the website for a moment. Hold on, let me shift over to Firefox. So if you go here, hold on 1 second. I need to move my little cursor here. This is where you are on the Penelope U Chicago EDU website, which was also on the syllabus. And this is where you can find the whole lives of the Caesars, in this case, Life of Julius Caesar, but this same website will have all of these texts, right? So if you look at the very beginning of this text, it's a little bit odd in comparison to what I have said so far. It begins by saying, in the course of his 16th year, he lost his father. Right, and I said that that usually Suetonius addresses a family's origin first, and so we are pretty certain actually is that the very beginning of this text is lost, and so this is sort of, we are getting maybe like chapter 2, even though it's marked chapter 1, but this is just an important point for us to notice. So to get back to our slides and to this text. So again, the opening is lost. In the course of his 16th year, he lost his father. And I think it's really interesting. It's already very richly giving us details about someone's upbringing. Obviously, if you know someone who lost their father at a relatively young age, that will give you a bit of a perspective that they had to grow up, say, at an early age. And then in the same first chapter that we do have, Sulla's view on him is quoted. So this is also interesting. Here is an incredibly famous figure, Sulla. So what did he think about Caesar? So this is what Sulla had to say. bear in mind that the men you are so eager to save will one day deal the death blow to the cause of the aristocracy, which you have joined with me in upholding. For in this Caesar, there is more than one Marius. So it's a really interesting passage. Clearly, Sulla views Caesar as an heir to Marius. And we get this sort of interesting way of Suetonius showing us that people recognize this about Caesar, right? And that Sulla had this view of him at this time. And so we get this very clear sense of his early popularis activities and his support for the people's tribunes' powers, clearly marking him in opposition to Sulla. Now, we do get a little bit of detail, nevertheless, on Caesar's ancestral claims in section 6. And this is how it is presented as part of that quote from that eulogy for his Aunt Julia. This is in section 6. So he says, the family of my Aunt Julia is descended by her mother from the king, and on her father's side is akin to the immortal gods. Gosh, we have to stop. That's a lot of stuff all of a sudden. Is it good to be descended from the kings? Well, it's arguable, but it's definitely a pretty remarkable heritage. And on her father's side is, there's something even wilder happening. Let's see, akin to the gods. For the Marci Regis, her mother's family name, go back to Ancus Marcius. Okay, that's the king side. And the Julii, the family of which ours is a branch, to Venus. Now, hold on to your seats. I know this sounds like a crazy idea that somebody would be descendant from Venus, but you might recall that Aeneas himself claimed, or was represented as claiming in literature, as going back to Venus in his ancestry. And so it's just one of those kind of claims that people can make in Rome in this period, is this sort of ancestral descent from the gods. And I think it also gives us a good idea of how much these people were above the average politician, right? So it really gives us a sense that, this is not someone you can just compete with if you are simply a descendant of a few consuls, right? And so this is how then Julius Caesar explains, our stock therefore has at once the sanctity of kings, whose power is supreme among mortal men, and the claim to reverence which attaches to the gods, who hold sway over kings themselves. So he's really making these connections and says, and therefore we deserve to be incredibly powerful. I will stop here and we will pick up the story when Suetonius discusses Caesar's consulship in the next lecture.